Okay, I want to try to walk us through where we've been so far. David Foster Wallace started us with learn to control what we think about. And if we try to connect that to what we've been reading so far, he is suggesting to us we want to learn to see the spin. We want to learn to see the basic pattern of all politics, the elite struggle to mobilize publics because changing the scope changes the outcome. If we do this, coming back to David Foster Wallace, we empower ourselves to begin to trust our own judgment, to reject what he calls the default, the automatic, the easy, the merely familiar, to get to the point of actually thinking. And to use the language of the rest of the class, to get to the point where we are framing our own perspective. And then we move to the Schattschneider's analytical framework. Watch the audience is what he started with. Why? Because we want to see that there's an elite struggle to mobilize new publics. And as we publicize and mobilize new publics, we expand the scope of the conflict, we impact the outcome. So for Schattschneider, then, this basic pattern of all politics highlights that politics is about strategy. And the key tactic in this strategy is conflict displacement, displacing conflict A with conflict B. Right, this would be called today agenda setting, right, expanding the scope of conflict A and pushing conflict B off of the public agenda. We expanded that to think about conflict displacement in a second way, that is, replacing one way of thinking about conflict A with another way of thinking about conflict A. That today is called reframing. That is, making this perspective on the conflict salient, rising to the top is what salient means, making this perspective on the conflict salient and muting or ignoring another perspective on the conflict, which is why we talk a lot about the struggle over scope and salience in this class, and you've become good at using that language. We've seen Cornel West apply this language to reframing the way we think about race. He argues that both the left and the right get it wrong. The left focuses on structure, the right focuses on behavior, when in fact we should be focusing on the relationship between structure and behavior. Today we would call that the relationship between structure and agency, or, to use the terms in our class, the relationship between the rules of the game and the strategies that then become winning strategies that make sense between structure and behavior. Because in Schattschneider's framework, as you try to reframe or displace your conflict, if you can change the game, all the better, because that changes the resources it takes to win. We know that he talked about electoral to interest group game, but we talked about several others: federal to state, federal court to state court, court to public opinion, committee in Congress versus in the executive branch. Changing the game changes what it takes to win the game. Then we went to Oven Birdsong, and we saw the insiders want to publicize contract clause cases. They want to bring those to court, bring the government in, expand the scope, but they want to privatize personal injury cases. The outsiders have the opposite perspective, and so we see the relationship between the two communities and what they value and their relative power has an impact on what they want to publicize and what they want to privatize, on what gets on the agenda, what doesn't get on the agenda, who's in the community, who's not in the community, what the law means in Sander County. In Galanter, we see the rules of the game in the court. The structure of the court impacts the behavior, the agency. The structure in the court makes it such that one player, repeat player, has access to a strategic option, a behavior that the other player, the one-shotter, doesn't have. Only the repeat player can play for a rule, and that leads to a tremendous power differential. We see in Cull, elites, in this case the White House, struggling to publicize their perspective on the invasion of Iraq and trying to push off, displace any other ways of thinking about the invasion in Iraq, to use the media to mobilize publics, as we see in the article that they did, to impact the outcome of the conflict, as they did, both the impact of the invasion and the presidential election. We see in Mann and Ornstein that they argue that the reporters both sides are doing it frame is inaccurate. They propose a reframing. In our media literacy exercise, we see that now it's important to have at least two sources of news, because you notice that when you read only one, you can't see the spin, no matter how good it is. But when you read multiple sources of news, you can begin to see the spin, as David Foster Wallace would want us to see. And finally, in Distorting the Law, we're going to look at a very intensive look at an interest group campaign to try to change the scope and salience of tort tales, they call them, or tort reform, and we want to look at how they did it. How did they successfully do this? How do you win the struggle over scope and salience?